Hello, and welcome to the official SCP Cosmology scale. This has took a long while to put together, over a week of scrolling through Wikidots to be precise, but finally I have come to a conclusion. You are free to disagree with what I have to say, whether it be how I order the cosmology or how I scale it, it's fine by me. This is merely what I have gathered from my research I have conducted this past week and a half. Although if whoever is watching this is going to treat this scale akin to a gospel of SCP scaling, I request that you don't. I have done my own research and I ask that you also do your own as well. On top of the scaling of the cosmology, I will attempt to clear up some misconceptions within the SCP scaling community, specifically takes such as the anti-noosphere transcending the noosphere, the infosphere being physically fifth dimensional, and some other arguments that I have heard to attempt to overhype SCP to the extreme. But enough with my rambling. This is Akari Cosmos speaking and is scripted, directed and edited by Anime vs Battles 42. To start, we have to explain the relationship between universes and dimensionality. In a discussion article on the SCP Wikidot, it is stated that realities beyond their reality, which is used synonymously and interchangeable with the universe, has no concept of geometry, time, space, life or death, to the point where they have no bearing on them at all, indicating that spatiality is limited to the universe. However, this spatiality isn't just a base 4-dimensional construct, not even an infinite dimensional hierarchy, no. It in fact reaches into the realm that is transfinite and untouchable, specifically cardinals going from Aleph null, Aleph 1, Aleph 2, and so on. This heavily implies that it would go on endlessly, meaning it would reach the cardinality of Aleph Mega, or the smallest replaceable uncountable of infinity. These dimensions view lower ones as if they were a comic book. As an example, just how Superman is non-existent to us, 3-dimensional beings are non-existent to 4th-dimensional beings, completing the requirements for a full qualitative superiority between dimensions, which thereby scales dimensionality and the universe to infinite layers into outerversal. Hell, you can make arguments that the universe is metaphysical and therefore beyond dimensionality. But let's not go there. Next up we have extra-universal constructs, more important of which is the noosphere, anti-noosphere and the infosphere. The noosphere is the collective human unconsciousness, namely Carl Jung's collective human unconsciousness. This philosophical theorem interprets that the human unconsciousness holds archetypes following in accordance with Plato's theory of forms. Platonic archetypes are the perfect form of concepts, being entirely non-physical and non-mental, showing that the noosphere is indeed transcendent over the universe, making it high outerversal, via the anti-noosphere being the equal to the noosphere, of which I will further explain as to why in the debunk section of this video, would also make it high outer as well. Eclipsing this to an incalculable degree is the infosphere. Something pivotal about the infosphere, which I discovered the same day I was finalizing this scale, was that the infosphere holds entities that embody retrospective Aleph numbers in a hierarchy dictated by size, which stretches to every Aleph before the inaccessible cardinal. The reason why I describe it as pivotal is due to the existence of what's known as a typefall tegmark, also known as the ultimate ensemble or theory of everything. This theorem necessitates that everything is dictated by a mathematical denotation. Now that we've established that via the fact I literally couldn't find anything that could prove that the infosphere scales higher than the extra-universal sector of the cosmology definitively, it would be contained by the multiverse. And just as you can't be bound by something you contain, the multiverse as a whole is beyond the very concept of Aleph numbers, necessitating that the multiverse under tier 4 tegmark, it would represent the inaccessible cardinal. Now, why exactly is this important? Well, just as how you can't be finitely above infinity, you can't be accessibly above the inaccessible cardinal. It would simply fall under the same mathematical denotation. Hell, technically the gap between the inaccessible cardinal and the stronger large cardinals have a larger than inaccessible gap. But let's disregard that. This would mean that every place in the cosmology that is represented as larger than a previous plane would require it to be an inaccessible transcendence, otherwise they would fall under the same mathematical denotation, which would contradict what is being stated. For simplicity's sake, let's colloquially name this the axiom of inaccessibles. This would comfortably place the multiverse at least high outer. Moving on, the multiverse, which is also called the true universe, is an infinitesimal fraction of the larger multiverse, or the omniverse. It is described as a fractal within a fractal, indicating a hierarchy. There being infinite multiverses would mean that there is an infinite fractal hierarchy of multiverses, and via the axiom of inaccessibles, this would make the omniverse infinite layers into high outer. Beyond this is what's known as the not abyss, or simply the not. A realm of non-existence that is defined specifically as not of any of the prior mentioned constructs, in the way that is beyond them completely. The not is lone world, one of 16 interconnected by ways. These lone worlds are metaphorically described as a hub or a kingdom, with all of its surround centralized structure that is the nexus of all of it, the Wanderer's Library. The Wanderer's Library is an endless, library containing knowledge from every world, universe and multiverse throughout all the aforementioned constructs. A sister site to the main SCP Wikidot is based off of it. This would conclude that the lone worlds and the library, via existing the same plane as the not, which is beyond the omniverse, would make them all baseline boundless with the use of the axiom of inaccessibles. Now, before I continue, I'll be explaining the system I shall be using after boundless, due to everything after it being fairly colloquial in that it's not on Versus Battle Wiki or in any other prevalent site from which formal tiering is usually derived. After the baseline there goes one layer into boundless, then two, then three, and so on until infinite layers. The gaps between these layers are that of an inaccessible transcendence. Beyond infinite layers to that same degree is inaccessible layers, then immeasurable layers. However, whether SCP truly reaches these tiers I just described will be answered soon enough. The next part of the cosmology goes by many names. The second, Hyoth, Yggdrasil, the Knowing Tree, the World Tree, but more common than not, the Tree of Knowledge. It contains all the previous constructs as one of its many branches, being beyond it entirely. Via the axiom of inaccessibles, this would mean that the Tree of Knowledge is a layer into boundless. Existing alongside it is the Tree of Life, both of which were planted by the Garden of Eden by Runheia. Via the simple notion that you have to be larger than something to contain it, coupled with the axiom of inaccessibles, yet again, this would mean creation or the Garden of Eden is 2 layers into boundless. The next part of the cosmology, yet again, goes by several names, to be specific, 3. The Voru, the Beyond, and the Dream of is Not. It is the darkness that encompasses all of creation, as if it was an island in an endless sea of nothingness. This would result in it being 3 layers into boundless. Okay, now we are going to have to get through some really complex stuff, namely narrative dimensionality, not to be confused with spatial and temporal dimensionality. Essentially, 3 Story is a metafictional representation of us, the readers of the SCP Wikidot. It is inhabited by author swan entities, horror writers, such as the metafictional representations of Placeholder MCD, and every other author that has published works on either Wikidot. Now, this is a lower layer in what's known as a narrative stack, or the narrative bulk, which is an infinite hierarchy of narrative dimensions. The narrative beyond the alpha layer would be 4 Story with 4 narrative dimensions. The next would be 5 Story, and so on. These narrative dimensions works similar to how we perceive pieces of fiction we ourselves write, non-existent. Higher swans on higher narrative layers write the stories of lower ones, and so on until infinity. And due to the axiom of inaccessibles, this would mean that the 3 Story would be 4 layers into boundless, 4 Story would be 5 layers, 5 Story would be 6 layers, and so on, endlessly and limitlessly until infinite layers into boundless. This is where I conclude the SCP Cosmology scale. However, I will be adding an almost theoretical way of getting it to inaccessible layers into boundless, and here is that meta. Due to how narrative dimensions work, 3 Story, having 2 real dimensions and 1 fake dimension would be what makes up the 3 narrative dimensions it holds, described as 66% real and 33% fake. Via this, 4 Story would be 75% real and 25% fake. 5 Story would be 80% real and 20% fake, and so on until Infinity Story, which would be 99.999999999 reoccurring percent real and 0.00000000 recurring 1% fake. This is important as the prime universe or prime dimension is described as 100% real, meaning it would have a fictional transcendence over the narrative stack. And, yet again, with the use of axiom inaccessibles, it would be inaccessible layers into boundless. However, why I said this was theoretical and separated from the rest of the scale is due to the fact that, as are detailed in the scan, the main author, EK, disagrees. It also literally only mentioned once in the entire catalogue that it is 100% real, and it's the scan I showed you. Sure, you can argue it, but it's too ratty in my eyes to include. But yeah, we conclude at infinite layers to inaccessible layers into boundless. This is sort of a lowball in the sense I didn't include such structures such as the cybersphere, semiosphere, Al-Lagada, the Gore, the Void, and many others. Now that we're finished with that portion of the video, onto debunking certain misconceptions within SCP and things that shouldn't be used. To start, the anti-noosphere being transcendent of the noosphere. I do admit, this is mainly my fault, stemming from my old SCP-682 scale. As a sidetrack, I heavily suggest that you don't use that scale, as there's many flaws within it. A lot of assumptions, basis claims, proof of surrogate, etc. But let me try to metaphorically convey the relationship between the noosphere and the anti-noosphere. Imagine two spheres, side by side. The left is the noosphere, the right is the anti-noosphere. Humans have excess and derive their emotions from the left, the right almost being foreign and unusual. This doesn't mean that the anti-noosphere transcends the noosphere, simply that they are two parts of a whole in a way. Another way to think about it is with antimatter. We can't perceive antimatter, but we can perceive matter. Does that mean antimatter transcends matter? No, it's a dual relationship, not one of a transcendence. Next, we have the use of this scan to prove that the alpha layer transcends everything below it. And yes, I did use this scan in my video, but the reason why I put it here is because the necessary context is provided from the main bulk of the text, of which that footnotes annotates. That's your reality, dear reader, is talking about the alpha layer, but only due to the context provided before that footnote. Next up, we have the infosphere being the fifth dimension. Not only is this inconsistent with how the noosphere and thereby the infosphere works, of which I explained earlier, but it's also referencing an aspatial version of the fifth dimension, as explained here in the discussion thread with Dr. Phoenix. One stupid argument used against SCP is one of all the feats are non-canon, which is really ignorant. All of the scans I have shown have been attributed to their respective articles on the SCP Wanderers Wikidot, which is registered under a Creative Commons copyright license. A CC license allows people other than the author to share, use, and build upon a creative work free of charge and without any legal repercussions. This means that yes, the Wikidot is canon. But that's pretty much it. As an extra to top it all off, I will be showing where characters scale in the cosmology, and where it would scale them in a cross-verse scenario. Thanks for watching all the way up until this point, and I hope you enjoyed it. Don't forget to click all the buttons, it would help boost my YouTube platform a lot. Anyways, here are where I think certain prevalent characters within the SCP catalogue scaled.